Cast Thunder Bay Natunchi. Hello, my name is Fiona and I'm from Thunder Bay, Ontario. During this video, I will be discussing storytelling as pedagogy. Growing up, I was raised by my mother, Yvonne Farker, who's originally from Glasgow, Scotland. I grew up learning Highland dancing, figure skating, learning how to play the piano, that sort of thing. I grew up reading European-style books and picture books, so overall a very European raising. My father, Walter Slipperjack, is from Fort Hope, Ontario, where my family is part of the Sturgeon clan. My father was known as the guy with a great big smile and always laughing, so he was a great storyteller because his stories were always filled with humor and laughter. I remember one day we were driving around Thunder Bay when he started to tell me a fishing story. He started to tell me about him fishing in this canoe on Whitewater Lake, Ontario, when all of a sudden he had a fish on his line. He could feel it pulling and pulling towards the bottom of the lake, taking line from his reel every swish of its tail. After fighting with this fish for a while, my father finally got it up beside his canoe. It was a sturgeon the length of his canoe, so really, really big. He was absolutely shocked and chuckled with laughter. He took the hook out of the fish's mouth and released it. When he was finished telling his story, I asked, "Why did you let it go?" He explained the story stays with you forever, but such an ancient fish and a beautiful fish should be left unharmed, as they are wise and a teacher to us. That was the day I learned I was part of the Sturgeon clan. Sturgeons have been on this earth far longer than any of us, just like stories. Kara and parents state, stories are the most ancient indigenous method for transmitting knowledge. Storytelling is different throughout cultures. For indigenous peoples, storytelling consists of teaching their listeners through the oral language. So what is storytelling? Storytelling is known as an art, a way of teaching, communication, and a way of remembering. In indigenous cultures, storyteller Basil Johnson states, "It is in story, fable, legend, and myth that fundamental understandings, insights, and attitudes toward life and human conduct, character, and quality in their diverse forms are embodied and passed on." Story is more than sharing laughs and smiles, but it also guides listeners through hardships, decisions, and character development. Johnston also states, "It is through our stories that the knowledge and understanding of one generation are passed on to the next. Although the themes are far-ranging and often deep and serious, the storytellers could always relate the stories with humor." When storytelling occurs in a community, often elders help each other with remembering the full story, or parts of the story. Every storyteller and every family has their own way the story is told. Storytelling is a way of life for many indigenous peoples. Johnson states, "There were no commandments, no laws, no courts, no judges, no dungeons. There was but one aiding principle that governed all life, and that was to live in harmony with the world and within one's being. Instead of laws that are guidelines, our ancestors made up stories to guide us along the right course." In Joanne Archibald's story work, she discusses different types of stories, such as sacred, historical, and cultural stories. Stories are unique to different tribes, clans, dialects, and locations. In Canada, for example, stories differ from the Blackfoot peoples, Anishinaabe peoples, and Inuit peoples. To Anishinaabe people, sacred stories are called Atisicanek, and news is called Debachimowen. Augur and fairies say Atisicanek are only told at certain times of the year, usually during the winter months. These stories are usually told by elders who have learned from a young age to tell a story. Every culture, tribe, group, family, and individual has their own way of sharing these stories and understanding them. So how did we lose storytelling? When settlers came to Canada, everything changed. Colonization, many stories and storytellers were lost. Effects of colonization are still felt today, especially with storytelling. Archibald states, "Indigenous stories have lost much educational and social value due to colonization, which resulted in weak translations from Aboriginal languages to English, stories shaped to fit a Western literate form, and stories adapted to fit a predominantly Western education system." Trying to fit the mold of the Western education system does not allow for authentic storytelling to take place, which in turn hurts Indigenous cultures. Many Indigenous peoples missed out on the opportunity to learn from their elders because of the Indian residential school system and colonization. I'm sure my father would have had more stories to share with me, but he was put in the hospital during the Indian residential school time because he was suspected of having tuberculosis. So thankfully he did not attend an Indian residential school. However, he was still separated from his family at that time. The result of the Indian residential school system was the inability to pass on stories, and for elders to train new storytellers, and for communities to raise their young with Indigenous values and traditions. In modern society, technology is starting to take over. Getting back to the holistic lifestyle for Indigenous peoples will allow for the culture to thrive. Daniels states, as in many other parts of the world, the former way of life is rapidly being displaced by modern civilization as isolation ends, and there is some urgency in recording traditions before they are lost with the passage of the still knowledgeable old people. Daniels recorded many stories, songs, dances, and she was able to share to help preserve that art. And that all took place in Lake of the Woods, Ontario, which is just north of Thunder Bay. Storytelling as pedagogy. Using storytelling as pedagogy will decolonize the education system and incorporate Indigenous knowledge that students can relate to. Western storytelling is used in the education system as a literacy building block. Students are to participate in independent reading, shared reading, and read aloud. The teacher with the text of their choice often does the read alouds. However, it is rarely a story that can just be told orally. Indigenous stories that are read by students independently or shared do not have the authenticity that an actual Indigenous storyteller would bring. Archibald states, whenever Indigenous oral tradition is presented in textual form, the text limits the level of understanding because it cannot portray the storyteller's gestures, tone, rhythm, and personality. Teachers need to be aware of appropriation when using Indigenous stories in the classroom. Archibald says, without basic cultural sensitivity among teachers, appropriation and disrespectful use of stories are more likely to occur. She continues to say, non-Native people must recognize that they don't have this cultural authority, even though they may acquire the expertise. Stated earlier, stories are unique to each tribe and location, so local stories can be a great way to teach students a lesson or history of a certain place. In doing so, teachers need to ensure they are following proper protocol. Goulet and Goulet state, gathering oral narrative forms of Indigenous knowledge from the community is important, not only to access the different stories that can be incorporated into the curriculum, but also to learn the protocols for storytelling in different communities. Learning these protocols will eliminate the appropriation of Indigenous stories in the education system. If teachers are uncomfortable or unsure if they're following proper protocol, elders could be invited into the classroom to share stories. Goulet and McLeod say, stories told by the elders are the building blocks of awareness and reconnection, a tool of decolonization as the story of the elder observes the story of the colonizer. When basing a lesson on story or using story as the lesson, teachers need to be aware of the different learning styles and learning rates of their students. Johnston states, all too often, a story is followed by an inquisition conducted by the teacher to make sure that the young listener has got it right, without regard for the listener's capacity to understand in proportion to his rate of perception. It is not a matter of knowing all there is to know about the story in one sitting. Using story as pedagogy in the correct way allows for students to learn an important lesson at their own pace, incorporate authentic Indigenous stories into the curriculum, involve community elders in the school environment, and creates an inclusive classroom dynamic. Many Indigenous families have lots of stories and stories to share. I wish I had that opportunity with my father still to hear more stories, but unfortunately he passed away 2 years ago. But with the help of teachers and elders, storytelling can thrive again. Using storytelling as pedagogy will aid in the decolonization process and help connect Indigenous students to their heritage in a classroom setting. If you're a future teacher, consider using Indigenous storytelling as a pedagogy in your classroom.